Hello and welcome back to the Viral Culture Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Aichabaya. And today we're kind of taking a little bit of a different spin on the regular programming where we focus primarily on international and things like that. We're going to be talking a little bit more about sex and, kind of like how we go about discussing and all the ins and outs of that. No pun intended. Uh, But with me to discuss that, I have one of my good friends from CMU. We've known each other for a few years now, Kendra. I'll let her introduce herself, but she has several qualifications and things there's a reason why I'm talking to her and about this subject. And there's a little bit more we want to dive into. But yeah, I'll let you have the floor, Kendra. You can kind of tell us a little bit about yourself, family, background.
Yeah. So I am Kendra. I grew up in Missouri, but I currently live in San Francisco. And I've been here about 4 years and moved here for education. I have a couple degrees and I plan to get more just around the realm of therapy and moving on with sex and sexuality. Yeah, that's kind of just who I am. And I've known you for about, I want to say almost 8 years now.
Yeah, because we went on that mission. Well, we knew each other before, but then we went on that mission trip together in DC. Wait, what was that? Which one was that? Was it DC?
It was DC, and that trip is actually what got me here. So it's kind of interesting.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, I did not know that. Well, yeah, that was a great. I mean, that was a fantastic trip as well. That was Thanksgiving, and we went to Campus Kitchen, right? We went to Campus Kitchen. And we made meals and things like that, and learned a lot about the homeless population, which I was not very aware of as well. But yeah, it's been about 8 years that we've known each other. We went to CMU together, but I'll let you kind of touch a little bit more on your background. So give us a little bit more about your education, at CMU, and touch a little bit on that aspect as well.
Yeah, so I have a bachelor's of science in athletic training that I got at CMU in Missouri. And then I now have a master's of sexuality from San Francisco State University that I just wrote my thesis on. And I also have a certificate in sex and religion. And this month I start a master's in marriage and family therapy. So yeah, I've kind of just continued through and made my degrees kind of link together. But I do plan to eventually get a PhD because I like the idea of being called doctor. Not the reason, but I would like to become doctor and also bridge together some of the conversations around sex and religion.
So so you talked a little bit about college there, and I think everyone now gets why I'm talking to you about this, because you just listed a whole list of qualifications about this conversation. But I want to kind of go back a little bit to reflect on my own. Okay, so I'll reflect on my own high school experience and education and about the topic of sex and things like that. So for me, because I went to an all boys school, we had I think they called it in primary school, we had this thing called EFL, which was Education for a Living, I think is what it stood for. And we would go to the common room as it would only be the grade 7, so the seniors, I guess you would call them. And we would all go into common room, and then this at that point it was the headmaster who would happen to be who was hosting this, and he would come in and basically be open floor, ask questions. So I mean, me being we don't know anything, so it wasn't really an education. It was just if I thought of anything, you're hey, what's this, what's that, so that was kind of the cusp of the early education on the topic that I got, aside from movies, and things like that. But back then, again, third world country, we didn't necessarily have phones and access to a lot of seeing that kind of thing, which is a good thing as well, I think. But as far as education on the subject, we didn't really know anything about it. And then when we went to high school, I think we had a class that was supposed to be for that purpose of discussing an education. But I don't really remember anything from it. So I don't know if that's I think that's a bad thing. I don't really remember ever being, and nothing stuck with me. I don't remember anything sticking with me in that way. But oh wait, I do remember actually there was this one documentary that they made us all watch.
Oh no.
That it was about this guy who went to our same school, and he was like a swimmer, like a big like fit guy, and then he went to college in South Africa and kind of went on a rampage, just kind of unprotected sex kind of thing, and he got AIDS, right? So
Oh,
so he basically got really sick,
no.
and so he documented like the last couple of like the worst part of his like dealing with it and everything like that. So I do remember that was pretty scarring, and basically made me like not want to discuss the thing or even think about the topic of something like sex. And I don't think I ever really had the talk like at home, really, aside from when I was coming here. My uncle kind of was like, just be careful, kind of kind of thing. But in my mind, I wasn't really thinking about that.
Mhm.
So as far as like that early education of the subject, I don't know if that's something you can relate to. So I don't know if you have anything to add to that.
Yeah, this is going to be kind of like a long spiel, but so primarily in the Midwest, I can't speak for other states because California is a little different. In 5th grade, they would separate what they said were boys and girls, and you would go watch a video. And the boys was like about like masturbation, and the girls was about periods, and they didn't mix those. So growing up, like people didn't know all of the information. And then when we got to middle school, I feel old when I say this. There was like this little slideshow thing where they had to like move it. I don't know. And all they did was show photos of people's genitals with STIs. And I remember that because that's probably why I wanted to study sex, is because I then became obsessed with understanding STIs. My mom probably thought I was wild, but I had a notebook where I would literally just research and write down all the information. As I went into high school, I realized that still no one knew what was going on. And so I was the one who would buy pregnancy tests and condoms for my friends. My mom would always be with me, and it's Midwest, so I'm pretty sure like the people at Walmart, they knew who I was, and definitely gave me tons of looks because I would be in there often. I didn't care because I still am just not that person to care what anyone really thinks. But there was no education behind it, and so it was a lot of I'd just be like, Mom, we have to pick this up, and she's just like, okay. We never really had that talk, and I don't even remember having that in college until I had to take speech, and I decided to pass out like a survey during lunch at CMU, and I asked people like how on it. It was confidential. I didn't care. And it was a very flawed survey, but it was like, how many people have you slept with? 0 to 5. How many, like, have you ever been tested? And I presented that to my speech class, and I was very much just like, oh, people are having a lot of unprotected sex. People are doing a lot of things and also don't have information. And so I definitely became obsessed with just the topic of sex and sexuality in general, based off of the lack of information. I don't like not having information. And so now even I work at like a sex store, and it's education based. And it's interesting because you have to be 18 and over, but people have lots of questions. And it's kind of frustrating that we're not given this information. And even if you are like sometimes growing up, like how we both kind of talked about, like you watched a video that was kind of scarring. Ours was just like also showing genitals that like definitely impacts the way that people view themselves, but how they also like then view sex. And that never really goes away.
Yeah.
It stays with you as an adult to like shame yourself and in some ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I agree. Yeah, we're on different parts of the world, but similar kind of like trajectory on the way that the conversation around the topic of sex goes, right? Because there's, like you said, there's almost like a shame that generates from it, and like a fear-based kind of and lack of knowledge, because like the fear is generated from a lack of knowledge of like the whole subject, right? And a lot of it, I'm not sure what you probably know more since you've studied it, the reasons of that, of like why maybe that's discussed that way. But I mean, I think for me, a lot of the schools I was in were Christian based, right? Were religion based. So I tie it to maybe that is the reason why it was taught, because, abstinence will be what's being taught.
Right.
And the reason that would be tied to abstinence, right, is what you're supposed to do. But because of that aspect, there's no education about how to be safe about it, because obviously the people are kids, so they're probably going to be doing it. And you might as well teach them how to be safe in that situation, so people know how to protect themselves and things like that. But when you went to CMU, right? You studied. So you said in high school you were interested in it, like early on you were interested in the subject, and then you went to CMU and you studied athletic training.
Yeah.
And then you jumped back to the idea of sex. So do you want to like elaborate a bit on like that aspect of it too?
Yeah. So when I was in high school, I helped with the sports teams. I helped with like all men's sports teams, so like football, basketball, and I learned how to keep the statistics for them. And so when it came to college, I actually didn't know what I wanted to do. And athletic training was just like the closest, like CMU was the closest to my mom. And I was like, it'll be easy. I know all these things. I did not. I know. But it was interesting because CMU taught me more about life than it did athletic training. I enjoyed the program, but it definitely is not something that would have kept my attention. But CMU kept me interested for multiple reasons, partially because it's a primarily white institution where, now that I look back, I didn't realize it. Well, like in the institution, right, you like have to reflect on it later.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting looking back and seeing that, like, as a mixed woman who was queer but didn't ever come out, the way that like Black and brown people were treated sexually, it was more of like a fetish, and it was even like a fetish not just with sex but like with sports. Typically, if you think about like soccer, right, there were lots of comments I remember being made about people coming from outside of the US to be on the men's soccer team, and like that fetishization of non-white individuals.
Mm.
And I definitely can see that, like how that played out within my own life, but it was very much like a building block onto why I then studied sex. And basically also like the way that relationships are built is because college is a time when people are usually far away from their families, and they get to do what they want, but the way that people, still young kids, because you're like 18, you don't really know what's going on, but the way that like people interacted and expressed themselves is still very intriguing to me. Especially a place that has like fraternities and sororities that doesn't really exist here in San Francisco, from my understanding. So watching how that plays out versus going to a college with 20,000 plus people is very different. And so while I was there, we talked about how I also met you. The reason that I got into studying into this in general is because we went on that trip, and Lucas, the campus minister, was like, Kendra, you should apply for this program where they send people around the world. And I was like, absolutely not. And my first interview with the people was wildly racist. And so I was like, I am not going to do this. And it was through the Methodist Church. And I was like, I'm not going to do this. So I tried to hide from Lucas. And I mean, like, literally, I don't run, but I like ran away when I saw him. And then he found me, pulled me into his office, and got me a second interview with people who understood. And then I ended up in Russia. So CMU is the entire reason that I'm now studying this without even knowing it.
That's awesome. Shout out to Lucas, by the way. I still keep in touch with him. He's one of my good friends. So he was always pretty good at like pushing people to do things like that. And it got you on the path that you're on right now.
I don't know if he knew I was hiding from him, but everyone else did. I was like, if you see Lucas, tell me I can run away. And then he pulled me into his office, and I am beyond thankful for that, because Russia is one of my favorite places in the world. And I would have never experienced that without him doing that. Because Russia, I also was working with people who'd been trafficked from West African countries. And so I was continuing this journey of like learning about sex from different cultures while also trying to unlearn the things that I had learned growing up.
Yeah, so you went through this program, right? And then you went to Russia and then you went to Kenya as well. So like I'm just trying to follow the whole pathway, like to get to like where we are now. So you get to CMU and we have that trip. I didn't even know about him approaching you and all that too. So you have that, and then you go on this trip to work with trafficked women or people. I guess I don't know if it's just women who get trafficked, but it's everyone.
So I went to Kenya through a different program the summer before my senior year. So that was before we even went to DC. Mm-hmm. And in Kenya, the program I was working with, we would go into the bush, which was interesting because I also think about missionary work as very colonizing. So it's really hard for me to like discuss it, especially I didn't have those resources or conversations then, but now when I look at it, I'm like, oh gosh. But we would go into the bush, and what we would do is we would ask the women, there were 3 of us, and then we would have translators. We would ask them about like their families and their birth rates and things like that, but we had to build the relationship. So I was already kind of having these like sex questions with people that were like very sensitive questions about like miscarriages and like things of the such. And so then senior year happens, I come back, we go to DC, and then after that I applied for this like young adult missionary program through the Methodist Church, and then went to Russia. And then Russia was, I love Russia. I feel very safe in Russia. I always like to preface it with that. I feel safer in Russia than I do the United States. I feel safer everywhere than I do the United States, but Russia specifically because I lived there for 2 years. And at first it was a lot of people are trafficked or told that like they're going to become babysitters or they're going to get their education or continue like being doctors if they move to Europe and they spend this money and then they get put to Russia. Russia's wonderful, but Russia is not what people think about as Europe. And so a lot of the times it was like talking to people and getting them the medical care they needed while helping them have translation for like repatriation or like refugee status. But a lot of the time my work was, when I got there, I realized that everyone kind of had questions about sex, Russians included. So I would go to this bar. If anyone knows me, they know that I lived at this bar. And I would also have sex conversations there. So Russia's another country that doesn't really have sex education. A lot of it is learned through porn. And so every time we were at this bar, I was like, ask me questions. I might not have all the answers, but I can definitely find us the resources. And so I kind of just like tied in my work. And like one time I brought back like 1,000 condoms and in my checked bag. I don't know what TSA or anyone thought, but it was literally just condoms. And then when I got back from Russia, I lived with my mom, had no clue what I wanted to do. And then San Francisco State is one of the only colleges that has a master's in sexuality studies. Oh. And so I applied and I got in, and then ended up writing my thesis on the Methodist Church and queer inclusion, because they voted not to have queer folks be like ordained, or there's a very big separation. So it kind of came full circle of like, I'd always grown up in the Methodist Church, but to see the process of like Kenya, DC, Russia, and then writing my thesis on it means a lot to me.
Yeah, so that was a lot. So thank you for sharing all that first. that was a good like arc, and I'm sure everyone was able to follow that because I was just like into it as well. So I wanted to ask a question because someone's probably listening to this, or if they're younger, like demographically, and they don't know like what what do you mean when you say like sex conversation? I guess like what kind of questions should people be asking? Like what are the, how does that go about? Like, how do you approach someone, or how do you have that conversation? Because I mean, you're very open, obviously, you're someone who's approachable, but like, how do you safely and appropriately have this conversation, I guess?
So first off, I wear shirts like this. So this one says, "Sorry, I'm late. I wanted to come." Um, which sounds vastly inappropriate, but I wear shirts that are very upfront all the time. Um, and that I think has made people approach me. And that means people approach me with every question there is possible. Um, I also always tell people that they can ask me questions, and that can be anything you question. So when I tell people that I have like a certificate in sex or religion, or I want to become a therapist for people who have religious trauma, um, we talked about how like we don't know why we were taught those things, but I know that a lot of what we were taught are based off of Christian values or religious values in general, um, which then has erased like the fact that different African countries have had multiple genders for a long time. Indigenous people who have had multiple genders, um, or two-spirited people for a very long time, and that gets erased. Um, and so part of it is like talking to people to decolonize what we've been taught, and to really question like, when you think about sex, do you feel shameful for it? When you like want to express your desires, or like want to talk to your partner or partners about something, what is that feeling that you have? Like, why can't you do that? I also am recording a YouTube series, and it's called The Bible and Kink. And when I say that, people's eyes get very wild, and I'm like, I actually talk about how the Bible, biblical stories actually break a lot of consent boundaries, especially when it comes to like women and the stories that we're taught. Those are a lot of the reasons that people who identify as women may feel shame when it comes to sex, because a lot of stories use women's bodies um, as something to be hurt. And so I usually think about the ways that people talk about or don't talk about sex. I've learned that people whisper sex, or like if they have a question to ask me. Even when I come back to Missouri, I wear these shirts, which is interesting in itself. But people will whisper questions to me. People at the airport will stop me and be like, "Hey, I like your shirt. Can I ask a question?" And nothing about me says like, "Hey, I have a degree in this," but people want to talk about it, and people want to talk about why they have these like feelings towards sex that they can't get rid of.
Yeah. So like you touched on something there, and that was very good. Like the idea of religious trauma, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like someone, like what would that look like? What does that look like to, like someone might not know that they even have this.
Mm-hmm.
So like what does that look like? Is that just like an idea of like the shame of the discussion? Like what you might, like what does that all entail?
Yeah. So when I think about religious trauma, I kind of think about my own, and the trauma that comes with people who having sex whenever you want is completely up to you. It is any decision you make. If it works for you, do it. But for me, I can only think about the fact that saving myself till marriage was rooted in shame. Um, and that even after having sex in whatever form, it continued to be this thing where it was like, what it's kind of like also what society says, but like, you're used goods. You're no good because you've done these things. Um, and then like also diving into like, why did I want to stay celibate till marriage? What was the real reason? Was it my happiness? What was it? Um, and also like as I continue that, like what conversations am I not having with my partner, because of gender roles, or just because like I've always been taught a woman shouldn't do that, a woman shouldn't act that way. So a lot of it is really just diving into understanding why you believe what you believe. And I realized that like for me, staying celibate till marriage had nothing to do with myself, but because I didn't want to be a bad Christian. um
Mm.
and so understanding to me that like if I believe in this God, I'm pretty sure God has more worries than what I'm doing in my bed. And not everyone's going to believe it that way. But in my mind, having sex is the least important thing about me. It is the least fascinating thing about me. I care more about the fact that, like, if I see someone, I treat them with kindness.
Okay. Yeah, that's good. And so looking at that, like that approach, and thanks for sharing that perspective as well. Like, do you agree that if someone can have, because I don't want to like shun people who are like,
Yeah.
I do want to hold on to my faith and save myself for marriage for like positive reasons. Is there like a positive to that you can see when you
Yeah.
like, yeah.
Yeah, I think that, like, saving yourself or not saving yourself is a very personal thing.
Yeah.
And so if that's what feels good to someone and that feels comfortable, then definitely do that.
Yeah.
I don't think there should be shame in any which way. If you want to have one partner, if you want to have hundreds. And that, I think, also goes for, like, there's a lot of conversations I have about, like, I am a woman, a cisgender woman who's also queer. So I date women and men, and I'm also poly. So I date multiple people. But that shouldn't invalidate the fact that someone is none of those things or also all of those things. People, like, being comfortable with the decisions you make, as long as they don't harm anyone, then there should be no problem with it. So if saving yourself is something you want to do and that feels good to you, then do that. And don't let anyone, like, sway you to make you feel bad in that. But that also goes the other way.
Yeah, and I just wanted to touch on that because I don't want someone to be like listening to this and then like think of the idea of like that what they feel and wanting to save themselves is a negative thing. Like, that's not what you're saying at all. What you're saying is like there are the reasons for it are probably what's more important than you choosing to do that or not. Like,
Mhm.
if I'm understanding that correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's because, like, regardless of what you do, society is going to judge you. And people are going to judge you. And so I don't want anyone to ever hear me and be like, okay, well, like, that I'm disregarding their feelings. Because I truly just believe that people should do what feels best for them. And regardless of it being sexual or not, I think that we should always, like, evaluate our relationships and making sure that we're doing what is best for us and making sure we're not causing harm. And as long as we feel comfortable in those things, then I see no problem with it.
That's a good point. So something else I guess I wanted to touch on is get your thoughts and opinions on is where should this education on the subject be happening? Like, is the responsibility falling on the schools, or does this fall to the home? Like, is this on the parents? Or does this, like, I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I kind of find there's that saying that's like, it takes a village to raise a child. I do not have kids. But I do work in a school district, and I definitely believe that. And I think it's a little bit of everyone's responsibility. So I just interviewed for a position, and one of their questions was, what would I do if I was in charge of, like, putting together a sexual health presentation for middle schoolers? And I was so excited about it because I was just like, I would make sure that all of the correct information is there. But I would also send home a packet to the parents. This is what we talked about. Here are some of the questions we may answer. Here are the things that we didn't discuss. So that parents also have the information, because I think that it would be hard for me to present this and then assume that parents also have all of that. Because that isn't true.
Yeah.
And so I also get that, like, San Francisco and California are very different, but I do think it takes everyone to give all of the facts so that people can make their own decisions. Because, like, I didn't do things out of fear for what I had learned, but I also had friends who did the opposite. And I think that if we had all of the information, it would have allowed us to, like, have these more open conversations and questions to each other where it wasn't like secretive. And can also be a way of like harm reduction. When you talk to people at a younger age about consent and boundaries, then it makes it easier growing up. Versus like now, a lot of the conversations I have with people, friends included, partners included, but it's where I'm like, hey, did you know you're allowed to set boundaries? With myself, you can set them with your family, with your other friends. Like, you can tell people no, and no is a full sentence. Like, you don't have to negotiate that. And so I definitely think it takes everyone. And that means even the person who is not with all of the information, it takes them being comfortable enough to ask the questions. But we have to provide that space.
Yeah. So I'm putting myself, I don't have kids anyway, in case of anyone who's wondering as well. But so if any parents are listening, right? So it's kind of a compound question that I have for you. What age would you think these discussions need to happen? And also the B part of that, I guess, would be like, how do you approach it? Like, how do you come with like just facts and like explain like this is how this works, this how this, or do you come from like present like, do you have questions about the subject and then like get like that back and forth? Like, is there a right way or just yeah?
I'm very thankful for TikTok because TikTok has showed me the way that parents are already having these conversations. But I think conversations start young. So I think they're also age appropriate, but with kids, I am always the human, or I don't have kids. I actually just had surgery to never have kids. But I think that I'm an aunt to a lot of children. And I always tell them, you can tell me no, but can I have a hug? Or do you want a handshake? Do you want anything? Do you want me to leave you alone? What would you like? And I think starting age appropriate questions like that, like kids aren't required to give me a hug. If like, that's just, it's not a thing. It'll never be a thing. If you don't want me to pick you up, I'm not going to pick you up. But I also set very clear boundaries with kids. Please don't do that. We're not going to do that. That's outside of my boundaries. And it's interesting because one of my little nieces, I've said that to her since she was like 2. And last time I saw her, she told one family member she wanted a hug and the other she didn't. And she said, you have to respect my boundaries. And I've never been more proud in my life to hear a child just say, you have to respect my boundary. And I was like, yes, that's all. That literally step one.
Wow.
So I do think there are age appropriate ways, and there are, as someone who doesn't have kids, I'm still learning like what that looks like. Because like we were taught, some of those things are a little bit like scary. But teaching and starting with consent and then moving as they have questions, I think is really important. I also think it's important to like teach correct terminology while also letting children use words that they're comfortable with.
Okay.
Because allowing like a kid to know like this is your body part, like it could be funny to them because everything's funny. It's funny to me as an adult. But like answering the questions in age appropriate ways where it's also not scary, I think is a good start. But definitely like teaching your kid they don't have to hug anyone.
That's something that's unique. I've never heard of that. Like thinking of setting up those boundaries at an early age so that people are aware of something like that. That's definitely like a great early approach. How about these questions are just coming as I keep going here, but how about who speaks to who? So does it make a difference if the dad speaks to the daughter about this, or like which switch of gender, whichever the reverse is? Is there an easier or more appropriate way for this? Is there any research or knowledge you have on whether it makes a difference?
Research, no, but sometimes I can only go from like experience, and I think it can be who the child is most comfortable with.
Okay.
For whatever reasons, but also like parents and families are teams. So just from my understanding and like my personal perspective, like discussing who, if there's a question, like I'm an aunt to a lot of kids, and I do know that. They're my friends' kids, they're my siblings' kids, but like talking to them about like, hey, once your kids learn what I teach, how would you like me to move forward if they have a question? Do you want me to answer it? Or would you like me to bring you into it so we can answer it together? Like, or do you want me not to be a part of it? Um, because that is something that should be discussed with the parents.
Mm-hmm.
Because they're the ones who are going to like go home with their kids. I found with some of my nieces, like they don't have so many questions about sex, but like boundaries and consent, like those things. I don't know if they quite all know that it's boundaries and consent, but they'll say like, can I say no to this? Absolutely. You don't have to give me a high five. Um, and so like, I think that for me personally, like as the kids get older, I very much am just like, what do you want me to do? Because I don't know your rules and I want to respect your boundaries as parents. How would you like me to answer this? Or would you not like me to? Um, yeah, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was definitely exactly what I was getting at there. How about, okay, so let's move to like the adult aspect of this. So if someone has a partner, like I I don't know how common it is, like to have that healthy discussion, like back and forth, like what advice? I'm sure you are probably the go-to person for like a lot of your friends, but like how to have these types of conversations, like how would you advise couples listening to this and like with someone else thinking about how to approach this conversation with a significant other about things they're into, what
Yeah.
whatever the spectrum of things they want to do there, um how to go about navigating that conversation to ensure a healthy and positive.
Yeah. Well, first I would say that they could come to me because I'm about to start coaching couples or people. So they could always come to me and book me to like have that one-on-one conversation. Um, but a lot of times it is a lot of communication. And I tell people that like there's never too much communication. And I think that that's still something that I have to learn personally. Um, because like me and my partner, we have like every night before we go to bed, we haven't done that in a while, but we typically do. Um, we do like 5 minutes. So it's 1 minute where you look at each other, and then for 2 minutes, someone gets to talk without being interrupted. I can't make a face. Um, that part's really hard. But you have to let that person just talk, and then we switch. And it's a way that like whatever they're feeling, it doesn't have to be about us. It doesn't have to be about anything really. It's literally just what comes to their mind. Um, that gives people a way to communicate their feelings. We also do that if we're frustrated. Um, and so having ways where you learn how to communicate with your partner, if it's sitting down every night for 5 minutes, cool. If it's doing that like during a fight, so you can't, like everyone gets to express themselves without being interrupted. Um, I think that teaching adults consent and boundaries is also step number one. A lot of us were not taught that. And a lot of us weren't taught that we could tell our family members no, that you can actually just like not talk to people if they're not good for your mental health. And so those are a lot of the conversations I have with like the people who do come to see me or friends, because like, what are your boundaries? I started making kind of like a boundaries and consent book for adults. I kind of tried to make it age appropriate, which is funny that we talked about that earlier. But like, what are your boundaries with your family? What boundaries do you wish you had with your family? And how are you going to say that? And it kind of just like talks you through what is a way that you feel valid. What's something that happens with your family that makes your feelings feel invalid, like things like that, to really make people think like, okay, this is something that I do that maybe I should change. Maybe I should tell my mom that I don't like when we have this conversation. And really just starting off little by like setting boundaries with yourself. or with your job, like things like that, if that makes sense. Like really just starting the loop over with adults and being like, hi, this is my boundary and I'm not going to cross it. And I'm also not going to let you cross it.
Okay. So is that like, I guess I'm trying to figure out like how I understand the idea of a boundary, but I guess I need like, do you have an example? Like how would you go about like setting an example with like at a job was or a boundary like within a relationship? Let's go like within a
Yeah.
relationship of a.
I can do both.
Mhm.
My boundaries at work are that I only work when I'm getting paid. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. I'm not going to do work outside the clock or outside the clock. I also have set days off. So Sunday and Friday are my day off. Probably not, if you call me, I'm not going to work those. Those are typically my non-negotiables with work. With partners, let me think of a boundary.
Or like any like family thing.
Yeah,
Or
no, I set them all the time. I'm trying to think of some of the funny ones, because that they happen every day, right? So like one of the boundaries we set this morning, we're just like, if you make the mess, you clean it up, which seems like something people would just be like, okay, yeah, but people don't always do that, especially because me and my partner don't always live together. Because he goes back to his house, so like, don't leave me a mess. I just need you to clean up after yourself. Or sometimes like other people have names they don't want to be called for whatever reason, whatever that is, but like, please don't call me this nickname. I don't like that. I don't want you to touch me on my back. Things like that are just like small boundaries. Also, I think that people should do their love languages. It is rooted in Christian theology, but I think that looking at people's love languages and being able to say like, I need you to love me this way. And because that can apply to your friends and your family and your partners, it's easy to say like, hi, I really like words of affirmation. So if I share something I did, if possible, can you just like give me words of affirmation around it? Not just like a congratulations, because those little things can make a very big difference in a relationship. Ones I kind of have with my family are just like, there are certain words there are topics that we are not going to talk about. Or like, if we have this discussion, we need to be in a place where we can actually have the discussion. We're not going to like start fights and then like walk away. I'm like, I want to resolve conflict as quick as possible with everyone. So if we're going to have like a family discussion about something that happened, I need us to set aside a time for us to actually discuss it. So we're both heard. We don't walk away being more hurt. And we can come up with a way to resolve it. Not that it will be resolved immediately, but that we actually can feel like we are moving forward as a family.
Huh. I don't know if it seems like you have this stuff like written down. I don't know where this is coming from.
No,
just like with all these thoughts, it's insane. It's funny. So I did want to like, that was great, by the way. That was very good. That was better answer than I could have hoped for. But another question I guess I want to touch on, in addition to what you just mentioned, was the idea of love languages, right? I feel like this is something that for me, I fairly recently discovered.
Okay.
Like the idea of it, right? So how do you go about identifying what is the way you want, like how do you know these things? Like sometimes you're just not self-aware of these, like what you need. So like, do you have any kind of like knowledge, I guess, on like how to communicate that, like have that come across and then know that, oh yeah, this is something I enjoy, and then communicate that across to your partner?
Yeah. So what my partner and I did is, I don't know if you can see it, but up here, back there, it says his name and his love languages. So there's a quiz you can take online. And what we did is we decided one night that we were going to take the quiz at the same time, and then take the time to write down what our love language was and how we want it shown to us. So we just very much took the quiz, and then like I have to, yeah. So his is like quality time. That's his number one. And on it, how he wants to spend quality time is going on more walks. That's all. And usually that means going on more walks, and he wants to play Pokemon Go, which that's the way that quality time goes for him. Mine, I always hate saying this because it just sounds weird, but mine is receiving gifts. But with that, I also love acts of service. So like receiving a gift could mean like a mop. Like I love just receiving something that's like practical, but also like you thought of me. If that means you bought a pen or a highlighter because I'm in school, cool. But I think just like very much taking that quiz either together or separate, but then giving each other a physical thing that says like, I like quality time. What that means to me is watching a movie or being in the same house together. I like personal touch. I would like to cuddle while we watched a movie. Like little things, because I think those little things are also what drive relationships to be a lot more intimate than what we think. Everyone has a very different thought on how they spend time together or what they want. And your partner, nor your friends, nor your family can read your mind. So you have to actually physically say all these things. And I think that goes back to like consent and boundaries. Is like you have to say the things. How people react to that, we can then get to that. But like you do have to acknowledge it yourself so that your partner knows.
Yeah, and I like that you said that people can't read your mind, but something like it's as simple as like, for example, you said your partner wants to go for a walk and literally and play Pokemon Go, but that's like something simple that you can do, but that will give the other person so much like joy, and like that's a positive positive reaction, right? And like will reinforce the relationship to where sometimes like you just don't know like what someone wants to do. Like when you get together, you're like, oh, what do you want to do? But if you realize that this person enjoys doing this, you're like, oh yeah, why don't we just go do this or that? Let's go for a walk and then you can play Pokemon Go, or it's something as simple as that because it's been communicated to you and you have the idea of how to positively reinforce this other person and like make sure that they get out of a slump, or if they're feeling down and stuff like that, how to address that in a positive way, I think.
Yeah, I think it's also like I treat and I say it and people are always giggling at me, my friends do, but my friends are also relationships. And so I am a huge advocate for also asking people like, how do you want to be supported? And that doesn't even mean something has to be going wrong, but hi, we have a busy week. I probably won't see you. How can I support, or how do you want to be supported? Because that takes me out of the equation. I want to know what is best for you this week. And if that's like, I just need accountability that I wake up for work. Okay, cool. I'll check in at the end of the week, and I'll see how you did with that. Because then I'm really bad at texting and communication while being on my phone. But I can set an alarm that says on Friday, check in with this friend. And so then even though we may not have talked all week, I'm still giving them the support that they asked for.
Wow, yeah, that's like next level friendships. It makes me question. Man. I'm just like, oh, it's been 3 months. What's up? How's it going?
I also don't talk to people all the time, but I feel like I try to check in often. I think in my head, I have to remind myself that I can't talk to everyone that I've met. So if I check in once a month and I'm just like, how are you? Do you want to talk? Is there a way you need to be supported? I feel like we can address a lot of things while also understanding that like people have a lot going on and I am not the center of their friendship. Because my best friends from CMU, we see each other probably 3 times a year, but we probably text like twice a month. And it's literally just a, hey, how are you? Miss you. Do any of you need to be supported? Okay, let me buy cookies from Mackenzie. Let me make sure that Meredith, how soccer's going. Where's Angela at? Like, how's Liz doing? How's Bun doing down in Georgia? So it's kind of just like our little like check-in group chat. And then we're just like, cool, we feel supported. we'll check back in.
Yeah, and that's just sometimes like the reality of like growing up, right? Like everyone, there's so much going on. It's not like a rather than just thinking, oh yeah, I'm just gonna focus on my thing. When it comes up, I'll reach out. If you have that like understanding that we'll check in regularly when what's going on. Do you need anything? I think that understanding makes it a lot better than wondering like, oh man, I haven't talked to this person. I guess they don't care about me anymore, kind of thing.
Right.
So I think it does provide that like awareness of everyone knows what's going on in the situation and how that's being communicated. So basically communication is always a plus.
Yeah. Communication and just making sure that everyone feels like their boundaries are being like adhered to.
Mm-hmm.
I think changes a lot of like adult friendships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely agree. So we kind of got up to like where you are now a little bit. Do you want to kind of like touch on like the end of like where you are now / where you like what's going on in the future for you?
Yeah. Boy. So I am about to, I say I want a PhD, but that's a lot more school. I'm about to start a master's in marriage and family therapy at the University of San Francisco. So it's 2 years straight through. But during that time, I just started setting it up, and it's like called Sex Talks with Kendra, where people can book to have these conversations. So like you can pay for like an hour, or we can check in more often, whatever you want to pay for. And it's a sliding scale because that I want it to be accessible to everyone, where I talk about like whatever you want to talk about, I guess is the best way to say it. But it's kind of like a pleasure coach. So I do work at a sex store, so I understand like if someone wants toys like for partners, or they just like want to know how to address things with their partner, like let's talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about like setting that boundary and just like being accountable to each other. And then eventually, once I graduate, I want to have my own therapy practice. So still being like a pleasure coach, but also being a therapist to those who have like religious trauma or sexual trauma of any kind. So I'm starting the coaching part while also just like I'm going to post like sex toy reviews. So that people who don't want to physically speak to someone, they might just be a little bit more shy or want their own space, can still see the toys and things that like could work for them.
Okay.
I also would like to travel and give sex coaching and sex education talks, just because I feel like small town Missouri, sometimes people have questions that aren't always accessible. So like when I go back home, making sure that I am accessible to the people who would like to have those conversations. Whether that just be coffee where no one knows what we're really talking about, or like talking to a big group, I would love to do that. Yeah, I think that that's soon where I'm at.
That's awesome. So wait, I have another question that you mentioned.
Oh.
You mentioned some stuff there. Have you noticed, aside from like the obvious like rural communities or small towns like that, it might be things like, or just based on location, like San Francisco, conversations like this are probably a lot more open than like in areas like this. Maybe, I don't know. That's an assumption I just made right there. Is there like a regional bias, like, or is there like a race type? Like, what have you noticed any like trends as far as like, is it not talked about? Is things like these conversations not had in cultures like Black culture? Because I think the subject of therapy more recently is being accepted within like Black culture, right? Because it was always like keep your business at home, like don't be talking to anyone else about that kind of thing, right? And that's just something that everyone's just known within the culture. Like I'm not even from here, and I know that that's similar to what it was like for us. Like it was like you don't tell anyone else about your business, really, right?
Yeah.
But have you noticed things like that? I guess like trends like that as far as conversationally.
I feel like when it comes to collectively, maybe it's still the same. I think people are kind of shy, and they don't. No one really wants their business out there.
Mm-hmm.
So it is hard because like people also don't want to say that they need to go to therapy, nor that they have questions about sex. And I think because, especially for people who are around my age, like 30, like there's a lot that has went on in our lifetime. And for everyone like below us and above us, there's just a lot. Therapy is not a bad thing, but I still think that has to be reinforced. And there has to be like this also acknowledgement that you don't have to have all the information. You don't always have to be right. And there is a lot of stigma that still exists. I think people think that San Francisco is like this very liberal place. And that doesn't always exist. Like, I did have an interview to become like a part of a community outreach for the school district, and one of the school districts. And one of the questions was like, if you have to put on a sexual health presentation, right? And so like that to me, amazing, made me so happy. But I also know that there will be people and parents who like don't like that thought. And that's okay, because not everyone's comfortable with that. But I do think that like, regardless of location, there are very few places around the world that are very open about like therapy and sexual health and just give facts, right? A lot of it will still be full of like policy, and very put into like a political gaze just based off what it is. Okay. So I think that like there's still a lot of stigma with things, but it definitely, with one-on-one conversations, people are like, oh, it's okay to like have these questions. And I'm like, I may have education like based things, but I do not know all of the answers. Mm-hmm. There's this entire bookshelf full of things that I would love to learn more on. And this entire row right here is just sex. So you don't have to have all the answers.
I think that's a great place, like, to let people know that, because a lot of people, I guess you assume that you do know everything, right? Because you think it's healthy and you're not, you're just doing what you're doing, but there could be more that you could learn or try, or, whatever down the line that you don't know. So you just know that not even you admitting that you don't know all of it, I think is also a big thing. And just showing that you're also like on this learning journey. So maybe someone will see that and be like, oh wait, so we're all just trying to learn more.
No one knows everything. Like, I am a huge advocate for like, also if anyone ever wanted to borrow a book or know like a book, I probably can find one for you. If you don't want to talk to people, because like there are lots of things that no one knows. This entire section is full of like, why are politics and sex so intertwined? Why is sex in the Constitution? Like, things that I guess I never would have thought about in high school or even at CMU, that now I'm like, I want all of the information, even if I can't have it all.
All right. Yeah, that makes it. So just to close out, I guess, as we wrap up here, why do you think this is so important? I guess, like, why, if you had to give like if someone has been listening and they're like, I don't get this, like, why do I need this in my life, kind of thing, like, why would you say what you want to do and what you're trying to learn, and why is this so important? Why do you believe this is so important?
Because sex and religion rule most of the things around us. And I think that having an understanding for why you believe what you believe, but also understanding the history of what is going on in your life and how that impacts you is very important. As someone who grew up in the Bible Belt and now lives in San Francisco, which doesn't have, I've heard it called like one of the least religious places, which also is interesting. But I think that understanding that sex is in every advertisement, everything that you see, but so is religion, and understanding how that works into your daily life is unbelievably important. Also because even if someone isn't doing anything sexual, there is still consent and boundaries that need to be discussed and need to be set with your job, with your friends, with your family. And having those communication skills can then help you articulate to your partner or to yourself what you want and need. When it comes to religion, I think as someone who continues to like look at these biblical stories, understanding the context of them, but also like, oh, like this is actually really harmful to someone who may have been assaulted, and is reading it. How can I have this discussion at Bible study, or how can I have this discussion with my friends or here at church, and what is that emotion that's going to come with that? So I think like understanding that everyone has a different path, but also that all of these things are going to impact you in your daily life are really important.
Wow. Yep. That was that was a very good like little elevator pitch. I think anyone, I'll sign up. Like,
Here we go.
Yeah, so you got one member right there. But that was all great. This has been a great talk. Just before we close out, I wanted to give you a chance to kind of again just throw out your kind of like a little bit of a soft promo. People follow you on wherever you want to be followed.
Yeah, so on Instagram and on Facebook, it's called Sex Talks with Kendra. I'm still setting it up, so be patient, just like a little bit. But it'll also be linked to a YouTube page and to like my own business page, where if you have questions, you just want to talk one-on-one, you can email me and we can set it up. You can set it up on the site, or you can just watch the YouTube videos where I give like sex toy reviews or have these conversations about like, how can you talk about COVID and sexual health in the same conversation with new partners? Because those are some things that we should probably address as we're still living in this thing. So yeah, those are all the things, and I will send those to you so you can add it on for me.
Perfect. Yeah. This has been a very educational, definitely a good point to stray off the path of like my regular conversations that we've been doing. But I think this is still very important, like I said, for all the reasons that you listed as well. And, I hope that someone might listen and realize and learn from this as well, and maybe reach out to you for some questions and things like that. I agree with you that I think this is very important. And I just thank you for all the knowledge and everything that you've shared. Yeah, I think this has been great. I hope that everyone listening or watching gained something from this, because I certainly did. And I hope that you guys keep listening, and we'll be back again next week. And thanks again to Kendra.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you guys.